My name is Rosie Sargent. I'm from Scion, and today I'm presenting about producing veneer and sawn timber from Eucalyptus fastigata. So the major aim of this project was to try and produce veneers for making Sargent plywood or laminated veneer lumber that had a higher average stiffness than you can get from radiata pine grown in New Zealand. And eucalypts tend to have stiffer timber than radiata pine, so we decided to look at Eucalyptus fastigata. Additionally, a lot of work that has been done on processing eucalypt around the world focuses on pulp regime logs, so young trees and stands that have not been pruned and have not been thinned. So here we decided to look at a stand that had been produced specifically for high value saw logs. So it had been high pruned, thinned, and the trees were a bit older. We wanted to understand processing issues around processing these eucalypts. So you get growth stress where the center of the tree is in compression and the outside of the tree, the wood, is in tension. And once you start processing that, you can get splitting in the ends of the logs, and if you're cutting boards off the logs, they can bend and distort. And also, if you're producing veneer, you want to make sure that you can actually glue it together and make it into things. So just a little bit about the trees. We found a small stand of 24-year-old fastigata trees in Marlborough. There's a little aerial photo there. And we got a pre-harvest inventory done where every tree was assessed. We then also measured the acoustic velocity and drilled them for a resi trace for a subset of the trees. And then 20 trees from the stand were harvested for this trial. The logs were graded specifically for the requirements for this trial. So the peeling and the sawing was happening at J&L in Wairarapa. And obviously for peeler logs, the logs need to be very round, the logs need to be very straight. And also in the sawmill, they produce high value appearance grade radiata pine for export. So they have quite tight restrictions about around their saw logs as well. So anything that didn't fit our specifications for this trial was graded as firewood, essentially. So that meant that we had quite a high proportion of out-of-spec logs, around 35% of the total recoverable volume. This also wasn't helped that during the harvesting, one of the trees split from end to end while it was being felled, which meant that several nice peeler logs ended up in the firewood bin. So producing the veneer, the logs got put on the ferry and sent to Wairarapa, and just over half of them were suitable for peeling. The main reason that they weren't suitable for peeling was if they had significant end splits in them. So you can see down on the bottom left, that log there, if you were to peel that into veneer, you would end up with some pretty ragged veneer sheets. The logs to be peeled were sorted into 3 stiffness groups. This was to see if we could use log segregation to try and really target the stiff veneers that we were trying to produce. And the peeling itself went pretty smoothly, and we ended up with 60% recovery from the peelable volume through to trimmed dried veneers. So we were quite pleased with that. So the main property we wanted to understand with the veneers was the stiffness. So the black lines in the histogram there is data from some typical production at the mill, and then the coloured bars are our 3 stiffness groups of logs. And you can see that even the lowest stiffness group of logs, we've got a significantly higher average stiffness compared to the typical radiata pine. And then that stiffness just keeps increasing with the higher stiffness log classes. So that's a really positive result. There was a potential issue with end splits in the veneers. Unfortunately, we don't know when this end splitting occurred in the process. Normally there will be a camera doing automatic visual grading of every veneer as it comes out of the dryer in the mill. Unfortunately, it wasn't working during our trial, so we didn't get that information of how many splits there were in the veneers immediately after they'd been dried. And once we got them here to Rotorua to do other measurements on them, they had been handled numerous times, and it's very difficult to handle veneers without damaging them. So that's a bit of a gap in our data. So now we have all of this veneer. Next step is to try and make some LVL out of it to confirm these properties that we've been measuring. So all of the logs that were not suitable for peeling, J&L offered to saw them into timber for us. Now, because the main reason that logs weren't suitable for peeling was because they had end splits, we were essentially choosing the logs with the highest levels of growth stress to saw. So we would expect to be seeing growth stress related issues with the sawn timber. Additionally, we were using a radiata pine sawmill that is not optimized for species with growth stress, and we didn't make any effort to try and change the way the sawmill was operating to be able to mitigate the effects of the growth stress. So the result of that was we got a relatively low green recovery of green sawn timber out of our logs. So our wood was then sent to Rotorua and we air dried it. We got quite a lot of cell collapse where the wood just basically shrinks in on itself during the air drying, but the boards were then steamed and had a final kiln dry, and that recovered most of the collapse. So the sawn boards were then graded, and the main reasons for them being degraded, so box grade, essentially reject grade, the main reason for being degraded down to box was because they had crook. So that's distortion where the board basically bends sideways. We had around 10% of the boards in a clears grade, and then had a high feature flooring grade, that's an Australian grade, which allows some small knots, resin streaks and features, and then cuttings grade where you're essentially cutting it into shorter lengths, so for finger jointing. The second most common defect we got were gum veins or keno, where a lot of the boards had either pockets or these bands of dark brown gum, and you can appreciate that a board like that can't really be classed as clears grade because it has large streaks all over it. So the key results from this work, the veneer stiffness we got was significantly higher than radiata pine. Generally the veneers peeled well, but there is this possible issue with end splitting that we weren't able to get to the bottom of. The sawing process was not optimized for growth stress, and it really needs to be if you want to get a decent amount of good quality timber out of it. And we need to find a way of reducing the distortion in the sawn timber, and it may be that improving the sawing would help with that. And another key take-home message for us is that you need to have a market for every single log. No, you can't just take the very best logs like we did and downgrade everything else to firewood, because then you are throwing away quite a lot of your resource.